The grand oak doors of the courthouse creaked open, allowing a stream of people to shuffle inside. It was a crisp morning, sunlight spilling across the marble floors, but the atmosphere was anything but calm. The trial set to unfold that day had already stirred whispers across the city. Journalists had gathered outside hours earlier, their cameras flashing as attorneys arrived in sharp suits, briefcases in hand. Inside, uniformed officers moved with quiet precision, securing the room, checking the benches, ensuring everything was in order. The stakes were high, and everyone could feel it. At the front of the courtroom sat the judge's bench, elevated, commanding authority. Behind it, the American flag hung tall, its presence a silent reminder of justice and truth. The jury box filled slowly, 12 men and women from different walks of life, each wearing expressions that mixed curiosity with the heavy knowledge of responsibility. They adjusted in their seats, some clutching notepads, others folding their arms tightly, already bracing for long hours of testimony. The accused sat stiffly at the defense table, hands clasped, jaw tight. His lawyer leaned close, whispering something meant to soothe, but his darting eyes betrayed nerves that words couldn't mask. He was a man used to control, yet today, control was slipping. Across from him, the prosecutor arranged papers meticulously, each page marked with notes and tabs, her expression firm and unflinching. She had built this case carefully, brick by brick, and today she intended to cement it. In one corner of the courtroom, a police officer stood with his partner, a German shepherd trained for canine duty. The dog sat obediently, posture perfect, its eyes scanning the room with instinct that seemed sharper than any human's. Its steady breathing was the quiet pulse in an otherwise charged space. The handler rested a hand lightly on the leash, knowing the dog didn't need constant direction. It understood its purpose in ways words couldn't capture. The benches in the gallery filled quickly. Families of both the accused and alleged victims had shown up, their faces tense, lips pressed tight as though holding back words better left unspoken. Curious townsfolk had also slipped in, drawn by the magnetism of a trial that promised drama. Among them sat a young mother, her presence easily overlooked, if not for the small child perched on her lap. The little girl, barely 3, swung her legs freely, the tips of her shoes tapping rhythmically against the wooden bench. She clutched a soft toy rabbit, eyes wide with innocent curiosity. Her mother whispered softly, urging her to stay still, but children rarely obey in tense moments. The toddler twisted, glanced around, then stopped when her gaze landed on the canine in the corner. Her little mouth opened in awe. "Doggy," she whispered, loud enough for her mother to hush her quickly. Yet her eyes didn't leave the animal. She was mesmerized. The gavel struck suddenly. The sound echoed, demanding silence. Conversations hushed instantly, the atmosphere tightening like a rope pulled taut. The judge entered, robes flowing as he took his seat, adjusting his glasses with measured calm. He surveyed the room, noting every face, every detail, the weight of the trial pressing visibly on his shoulders. When he spoke, his voice filled the chamber with authority. "Court is now in session." The prosecutor rose, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She introduced the case with confidence, her words deliberate, each syllable designed to hold the jury's attention. She painted a picture of deceit, betrayal, and evidence stacked against the man at the defense table. Her voice didn't waver once, and the jurors leaned forward, listening, some nodding as if already persuaded. The defense attorney countered, his tone calm but defensive, warning the jury not to be swayed by appearances. He insisted there was more to the story, that truth was tangled and not easily pulled apart by rehearsed words. His client, he promised, was innocent of the charges. His words were polished, but his client's restless shifting betrayed cracks in their presentation. The young mother in the gallery glanced nervously between the lawyers, her toddler still staring fixedly at the police dog. Occasionally, the child whispered "doggy" again, earning another sharp hush from her mother. But the girl wasn't easily distracted. While adults battled with logic, evidence, and strategy, her innocent eyes had already found something else entirely. The dog shifted slightly, ears twitching, as though sensing the attention. Its gaze briefly swept over the child, then returned to the defendant. The handler noticed, but said nothing, merely tightening his grip on the leash. The animal's instincts had guided him through countless operations, but today was supposed to be routine, just security, nothing more. Yet, as the minutes ticked by, a subtle tension seemed to coil in the air around the dog. Testimonies began. Witnesses were called, each stepping nervously into the box, swearing the oath, and recounting their side of events. The prosecutor's questions cut sharp and precise, the defense interjecting with objections, their voices clashing like swords in the charged space. The judge ruled calmly on each one, though his eyes occasionally betrayed a flicker of irritation at the bickering. Journalists scribbled furiously, pens scratching across notebooks, already crafting headlines for the evening. High-profile trial takes dramatic turn. One muttered under her breath, anticipating fireworks that hadn't even begun. In the back row, the toddler's focus never wavered. While others strained to dissect lies from truth, her small world had narrowed to one thing: the dog in uniform. She leaned closer to her mother, her finger twitching as though itching to point. Every adult in the room was locked into the familiar rhythm of courtroom. Battles, questions, objections, evidence, rebuttals. But the atmosphere carried a subtle charge, a sense that something unexpected lurked beneath the surface, waiting to reveal itself. The defendant's nervous glances didn't go unnoticed. The prosecutor pressed harder, her voice sharper. The defense grew louder, more desperate. The jury scribbled notes, exchanging fleeting looks of doubt. Through it all, the toddler swayed gently in her mother's lap, humming softly, her eyes glued to the German shepherd. The dog's ears pricked suddenly, as though hearing something no one else did. A low rumble stirred in its chest, but faded quickly as the handler placed a calming hand on its shoulder. Few noticed, but the child did. Her eyes widened, lips parting in quiet wonder. The morning session pressed on, the gavel striking twice more to restore order amid heated exchanges. Yet, tension only grew. It was a trial hanging in delicate balance, with lives, reputations, and justice at stake. Everyone was watching: the lawyers, the witnesses, the judge. Everyone, that is, except one small girl. She wasn't concerned with evidence, testimonies, or verdicts. Her world was simple, unclouded by politics or procedure. She saw the dog. She saw its eyes. And somewhere deep inside her innocence, she believed she understood what it already knew. What no one realized was that her small, curious gaze and the words forming quietly in her mind would soon silence the entire courtroom and change the course of the trial forever. The courtroom hummed with the rhythm of formality. Papers shuffled, lawyers whispered to clients, and the jury adjusted uncomfortably on their benches. It was the natural flow of any trial, yet there lingered an odd heaviness in the air, something unspoken, almost invisible. Every adult seemed to feel it on the edges of awareness, though no one dared to name it. Only the child, perched restlessly on her mother's lap, appeared untouched by the solemn tension. For her, this wasn't a place of justice or punishment. It was a room with shiny wood, tall ceilings, and, most importantly, a dog. Her wide eyes followed the German shepherd with fascination. The animal sat tall, regal even beside its handler, as though sculpted from stone. Its fur gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and its amber eyes reflected calm intelligence. To most, the dog was a mere part of courtroom security, present, respected, but silent. Yet, to the toddler, The animal was the center of the entire scene. She tilted her head, studying him as she might study a toy she didn't yet understand. At first, her attention seemed innocent distraction. She tugged lightly on her mother's sleeve, whispering, "Doggy, Mommy, doggy." The mother sighed, shushing her gently, offering a toy rabbit in hopes of redirecting her attention. But the child was stubborn, wriggling until she had a better view. She leaned forward, eyes narrowing as though she could read some hidden secret in the shepherd's steady gaze. The German shepherd flicked an ear, acknowledging her stare. It didn't break composure, but its gaze shifted momentarily, meeting the child's. Something passed between them, something unnoticed by the sea of adults, too busy with testimony and arguments. The toddler smiled faintly, then froze. Her little brow furrowed, as though she had just realized something important. Meanwhile, the prosecutor pressed a witness, her voice sharp with purpose. "Did you or did you not see the defendant near the scene that night?" she demanded. The witness hesitated, stammering, I think so, but it was dark." The defense attorney pounced instantly, his voice booming as he objected, accusing the prosecution of leading. The judge sighed, ruling with measured patience, restoring order with a firm gavel strike. But the child paid none of this attention. She was studying the dog with a seriousness far beyond her years. She shifted on her mother's lap, her finger twitching as though itching to point. The mother tried to distract her again, but the toddler wriggled free, now standing on the bench, steadying herself against the wooden backrest. Her eyes never left the animal. The dog's handler, sensing movement, glanced briefly toward the gallery. His gaze softened slightly at the sight of the child's curious stare, but he quickly returned to his post. Still, he noticed something unusual. The dog's breathing had changed, subtle but distinct. The shepherd's chest rose and fell with a rhythm that suggested heightened focus, the kind it usually displayed on patrols, not in quiet, controlled spaces like this. He gave the leash a gentle tug, murmuring a calming command, but the dog remained fixated on the defense table. The accused, oblivious to the child's gaze, leaned toward his lawyer, whispering urgently. His voice carried just enough to reveal his frustration. The defense attorney raised a hand to quiet him, but the damage was done. The jury noticed his unease, exchanging silent looks that hinted at doubt. The toddler, too young to comprehend legal tactics, only knew what she saw: a nervous man, a focused dog, and something about the connection that unsettled her in ways she couldn't explain. She lifted her hand suddenly, finger pointing straight toward the shepherd. Gasps whispered through the gallery as a few noticed, though most assumed it was harmless play. Her mother tugged her hand down quickly, whispering sharply, "Not now, sweetie." The little girl pouted, but didn't sit back down. Instead, she leaned closer, her small voice carrying farther than her mother expected. "Doggy knows." The words were soft, almost drowned out by the courtroom noise, but they carried a peculiar weight. A reporter in the back raised his head. Pen paused mid-sentence. The judge's clerk glanced up briefly, brows furrowed. The dog's handler heard it too, and though he knew it was childish rambling, a strange shiver ran up his spine. As if to punctuate the moment, the dog shifted suddenly, ears perked, body leaning forward slightly on its haunches. The handler gave a firmer tug, whispering a command, but the shepherd ignored him for a second longer than usual. Its gaze remained locked, not at the child, but past her line of sight, directly toward the defendant. The toddler noticed instantly. She clapped her hands together, her voice ringing clearer this time. "See? Doggy knows." The mother flushed red, embarrassed, trying desperately to hush her daughter, but the damage was done. Heads turned. The jury exchanged questioning glances. Even the judge paused, eyes narrowing, as though debating whether to address the disruption. The defense attorney slammed his hand on the table, frustration bleeding through. Your Honor, are we to let childish distractions disrupt serious proceedings? His voice cracked slightly, betraying more than annoyance. It hinted at fear. The prosecutor remained silent, but her lips curled into the faintest smile. The judge hesitated. His duty was to maintain order, yet something in the room had shifted. He cleared his throat, tapping the gavel lightly. Let us proceed, he ordered, but his voice lacked the same firmness it carried earlier. The jury, though silent, carried the moment with them. They had seen the defendant's unease, the dog's sudden alertness, and the child's pointed declaration. Logic told them it was coincidence. Yet instinct whispered otherwise. The toddler, meanwhile, sat back down, content, as though she had already said what needed to be said. Her mother cradled her tightly, cheeks burning from the attention, but the child didn't care. She hummed quietly, patting her rabbit toy, while her eyes drifted once more to the German shepherd. The dog, calmer now, returned to its poised posture. Yet the handler couldn't shake the unease that lingered. He had trusted this animal through countless operations. He knew its instincts, its signals. And something about today was different. Something about the defendant had triggered the shepherd's silent alarms. The courtroom moved on, the flow of questions and answers resuming. But the air was changed. Tension buzzed, subtle yet undeniable. Every juror now stole glances at the defendant with suspicion they hadn't carried before. Every reporter scribbled notes with renewed urgency, sensing a story bigger than they had anticipated. And in the back row, a toddler swayed gently in her mother's lap, blissfully unaware of the storm she had ignited. She had only pointed at a dog. She had only spoken a few simple words. Yet those words would echo in every corner of that courtroom before the day was over. The courtroom had settled into its rhythm again. The prosecutor questioned witnesses with sharp precision. The defense countered with objections, and the judge presided with a steady hand. Yet beneath the surface, an unease lingered, faint but undeniable. It clung to the jurors, whispered through the gallery, and made even the seasoned officers shift in their seats. For all its order, the room carried a charge like the stillness before a storm. On her mother's lap, the toddler squirmed impatiently. She had endured long stretches of grown-up voices she couldn't understand. Their words bounced off her like rain on glass, loud, serious, and meaningless. To her, the world in that courtroom had boiled down to two things: a man who looked nervous, and a dog who seemed to know why. Her small fingers fidgeted with a rabbit toy, stroking its worn ears until they drooped. She glanced toward her mother, who was distracted by the arguments unfolding. Then her eyes flicked back to the German shepherd. The dog was no longer entirely still. Its body remained disciplined, but its eyes burned with focus, watching the defendant with the intensity of a predator stalking prey. The child tilted her head, just as the dog had done moments earlier. She studied the man at the defense table with the same seriousness, though her understanding was instinct rather than intellect. In her mind, the pieces connected as only a child could connect them. The dog knew. She knew. And she needed everyone else to know. She tugged her mother's sleeve. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice small but urgent. Her mother didn't look down. She was busy following the prosecutor's line of questioning. She murmured distractedly, patting her daughter's hand. But the toddler didn't stop. She wriggled forward on the bench, knees pressing against the wooden backrest in front of her. She took a deep breath, puffing her cheeks like she'd seen adults do before speaking. And then, clear as a bell, her voice cut through the courtroom. "Doggy knows the bad man." The words hung in the air like shattered glass. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The judge froze, eyes wide behind his glasses. Jurors blinked in unison, stunned as though they hadn't heard correctly. The attorneys stopped mid-motion, their arguments silenced by the innocent interruption. Even the court reporter hesitated, hands pausing on the stenograph machine. A ripple of whispers surged through the gallery. Heads turned, eyes darted toward the source. The young mother flushed crimson, mortified. She scooped her daughter closer, whispering frantically, "Darling, not now." But the toddler resisted, her little arm extending as she pointed directly toward the dog, then toward the defendant. Her voice rang louder this time, filled with the certainty only innocence could muster. "Doggy knows who's bad." The murmur grew into a wave. The jurors exchanged uneasy glances, some covering their mouths, others staring openly at the defendant. The man at the defense table stiffened, his jaw tightening as sweat gleamed on his forehead. He shot a sharp look toward the child, as though her words carried more weight than he dared admit. The dog responded before anyone else. Its ears shot up, and a low growl rumbled in its throat. The sound was soft but primal, reverberating through the hushed courtroom. The handler tightened his grip on the leash, whispering a command, but the dog's focus didn't break. Its gaze remained locked on the defendant, body rigid with alertness. The judge finally broke the silence. He cleared his throat, his voice wobbling slightly as he tapped the gavel. "Order! We will have order in this courtroom." Yet the gavel's sharp crack did little to erase the tension. Everyone had seen the same thing: a child's innocent declaration and a dog's instinctive response. The defense attorney shot to his feet, his face flushed. "Your Honor, this is absurd. We cannot allow the ramblings of a child barely able to form sentences to influence these proceedings." His voice wavered between outrage and desperation, betraying his unease. But the prosecutor remained seated, her expression unreadable. She simply folded her hands, eyes fixed on the defendant, as though silently letting the moment play out. The toddler, oblivious to the weight of her words, wriggled again, trying to stand on the bench. She clapped her hands, delighted by the attention, and repeated once more for emphasis, "See? Doggy knows." Her mother buried her face in her hands, whispering apologies to those around her. Yet the damage was done. The courtroom had shifted. The jurors couldn't unsee the dog's growl or unhear the child's certainty. Logic told them it was nothing, a coincidence, an innocent outburst. Yet instinct whispered that truth sometimes emerged from the unlikelist mouths. The judge sighed, rubbing his temples. He called for a brief recess, perhaps hoping to shake the strangeness from the air. But as the gavel struck and the jurors filed out, their whispered conversations carried one unshakable theme. Maybe the child was right. The defendant remained at the table, shifting uncomfortably. His lawyer leaned close, whispering harshly, but his eyes betrayed fear. For the first time, the man looked less like someone defending his innocence, and more like someone cornered. The handler knelt beside his dog, stroking its fur gently, trying to calm the animal. But the shepherd's eyes never wavered. They stayed locked on the defendant until the man disappeared from view. And the toddler? She leaned against her mother's shoulder, satisfied, her mission complete. She didn't know about trials, evidence, or verdicts. She only knew what her heart told her. And her heart believed the dog knew something no one else dared to say. What the adults dismissed as childish nonsense would soon unravel into a revelation that neither the judge, jury, nor defendant could escape. The storm had arrived. The courtroom was never the same after the toddler's words. The gavel had struck for recess. Yet even as people stretched their legs and murmured in the hallways, the tension clung to the air like a storm cloud that refused to pass. When the jurors returned, their footsteps carried a heaviness. They had been instructed not to discuss the case, but no instruction could erase the image that played over in their minds. The child's finger pointing, her clear voice declaring, Doggy knows the bad man. Inside the chamber, the judge adjusted his glasses and rubbed his temples. He had dealt with unruly witnesses, emotional outbursts, even attempts at theatrics. But this was different. This was a disruption not born from strategy or manipulation, but from innocence. He reminded himself sternly that justice required logic, facts, and admissible evidence. And yet, no matter how he tried, he couldn't dismiss the moment. The child's words had been too pure, the timing too uncanny, and the dog's reaction far too precise. The defendant sat stiffly, a bead of sweat tracing down his temple despite the cool air conditioning. Only hours before, he had leaned back confidently, exchanging occasional whispers with his lawyer. Now he hunched forward, his shoulders tense, his jaw clenching and unclenching. He caught the eyes of jurors staring at him, then quickly looked away. He muttered under his breath to his attorney, but his lips quivered as he spoke. The defense attorney, once polished and commanding, now seemed rattled. His papers shuffled noisily as he tried to regain composure. He knew the child's statement had no legal weight. It could not be evidence. It could not be testimony. And yet, he had seen the way the jury reacted. They had leaned back, startled, eyes darting between the dog and his client. That single moment had painted his client in a light no cross-examination could easily wash away. The prosecutor didn't need to mention it. She understood the subtle power of silence. As she called the next witness, her tone was calm, professional, but with an undercurrent of confidence that hadn't been there before. She didn't have to say, "Remember what the child said." She knew they already did. Instead, she wove her questions around inconsistencies, pointing out the small cracks in the defendant's story. Each question, each answer, layered suspicion upon suspicion. The jurors scribbled notes, their expressions sharpening. One woman tapped her pen against her notebook, her lips pressed tightly together. A man in the back row rubbed his chin, his eyes flicking from the defendant to the police dog that now lay stretched beside its handler. The dog wasn't restless, but it wasn't relaxed either. Its body was taut, ears angled forward, gaze unwavering. Every so often, it exhaled sharply through its nose, a sound more like a warning than a breath. The handler noticed too. He had partnered with the German Shepherd for years, trusted its instincts in the field countless times. The animal's behavior wasn't random, it was targeted. His hand remained firm on the leash, but his chest felt tight. He glanced briefly toward the judge, wondering if he should intervene, then thought better of it. Midway through the prosecutor's questioning, the defendant shifted in his seat, exhaling loudly. His face reddened, his jaw twitched, and his hands balled into fists. When the prosecutor pressed him on a contradictory statement he had made earlier in the investigation, he snapped, slamming his palm on the table. "This is nonsense," he barked, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. "You're twisting everything I say." The room froze. Every head turned. His lawyer tugged at his sleeve, whispering urgently, but it was too late. His anger had filled the chamber, and anger, in that moment, felt a lot like guilt. The dog reacted instantly. With a sharp growl, it rose from the ground, hackles raised, muscles rippling. The sound was primal, unmistakable, a predator's warning. The gallery gasped as the handler gripped the leash with both hands, holding the animal back. The growl reverberated across the walls, vibrating in the chests of everyone who heard it. And then, in the midst of that chaos, the child's small voice piped up again, clear as a bell. "See, Doggy knows," she declared, clapping her hands as though she had just won a game. The effect was seismic. Gasps rippled through the jury. A woman covered her mouth with both hands. A man exchanged a wide-eyed look with the juror beside him. The prosecutor stood silent, lips pressed thin but eyes glittering. The defense attorney shot to his feet, shouting for order, insisting that the jury disregard what was happening. The judge pounded his gavel, his voice booming. "Order! I demand order in this courtroom." His tone was sharp, his face flushed. Yet even he felt the tremor in his own hands as he gripped the bench. He told himself to dismiss it, to remind the jury that justice could not hinge on a child's words or an animal's instincts. But deep in his chest, where law and logic could not reach, something gnawed at him. What if they were right? The gallery buzzed with whispers, the kind that couldn't be contained. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens racing across notepads. This was the kind of detail that would make headlines by evening. People would talk about this case not for the legal arguments, but for the moment, a toddler and a dog aligned in uncanny accusation. The defense attorney finally regained control of his voice. "This is absurd," he shouted. "We are allowing a child's babbling and a dog's growl to influence serious judicial proceedings. This is not justice, it's hysteria." But his words rang hollow. He saw it in the jury's eyes. He saw it in the way they leaned back from his client, the way suspicion hardened their faces. His client's outburst, the dog's growl, the child's exclamation, they had formed a triangle of truth, stronger than any closing argument could dismantle. The judge, his gavel still in hand, declared another recess. "The court will reconvene shortly," he said, his voice strained. As the jurors filed out, their eyes never left the defendant. They didn't look at the lawyers, or the judge, or even the dog. Their gaze was fixed squarely on the man accused, and it was not a gaze of doubt anymore. It was a gaze of certainty taking root. The defendant slumped back into his chair, chest heaving, face pale. His lawyer leaned close, whispering furiously, but he didn't respond. His eyes remained locked on the shepherd, whose gaze hadn't shifted once. In the gallery, the toddler, nestled into her mother's lap, her energy fading as though the spectacle she had caused had drained her. She yawned, tugging her rabbit closer. For her, it was simple. The doggy knew, and she had said it. But for everyone else in that courtroom, the child's innocent words had transformed into something far more dangerous, seed of suspicion that was now impossible to uproot. And as the judge retreated to chambers, heart heavy, he knew the case had entered uncharted territory. Logic alone might not decide this trial anymore. Something deeper, more primal, had taken hold. The courtroom had barely regained composure when the tension snapped again. The moment the defendant slammed his palms on the table, the German shepherd's instincts ignited like a spark hitting dry tinder. It rose sharply to its feet, hackles bristling, lips curled back to reveal sharp teeth. The growl that followed was low, guttural, vibrating through the chamber with a force that made spines stiffen and breaths catch. The handler yanked firmly on the leash, pulling the dog close to his leg. "Easy, boy. Easy," he murmured, but his voice betrayed strain. The shepherd wasn't lunging blindly. It was focused, eyes locked directly on the man seated at the defense table. Every muscle in its powerful body trembled with restrained energy, its claws scraping faintly against the polished floor as it tried to advance. Gasps erupted from the gallery. A woman clutched her child's hand tightly, her face pale. Reporters scribbled so fast, their pens scratched like frantic whispers. The jurors instinctively leaned back, some even placing their hands on the bench before them, as if to shield themselves. The entire room had frozen, suspended between fear of the dog and suspicion of the man it targeted. The toddler's voice sliced through the tension, innocent yet chillingly certain. "See? Doggy knows." She clapped her hands with delight, bouncing slightly on her mother's lap as though watching a favorite cartoon rather than a serious trial. The defendant shot to his feet, his face crimson, his voice cracking with fury. "This is insane. That mutt doesn't know anything. This is a setup, some kind of trick." His eyes darted wildly, first at the jury, then at the judge, then back at the snarling dog. His breath came fast, shallow, like a cornered man fighting to maintain composure. The defense attorney leapt up beside him, hands raised as though to calm both his client and the court. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. We cannot allow an animal to intimidate the jury, nor can we permit the ramblings of a toddler to influence a criminal proceeding. I demand the jury be instructed to disregard this distraction immediately." The judge's gavel cracked against the block. "Order!" he roared, though his own voice wavered with the strain of maintaining control. His eyes flicked to the dog, then back to the defendant, and a seed of doubt rooted deeper within him. He repeated the command for order, but the courtroom was a forest of whispers and gasps that refused to quiet. The prosecutor stood slowly, her expression composed, but her eyes glinting with sharpness. She did not speak, not yet. She knew that every word spoken in this moment could either strengthen or weaken the impact of what everyone was witnessing. She simply folded her hands at her waist and let the room absorb the sight. A police dog trained to detect danger straining against its handler, focused solely on the accused. The handler tried again to steady the dog, but the shepherd refused to retreat. It pulled forward, paws scraping against the floor as its growl deepened into a bark that thundered through the chamber. The sound jolted every heart in the room. For the jury, the message was clear: the animal sensed something no one else could deny. The accused shouted again, his words tumbling out in panicked waves. "This is prejudice. That dog's been trained to make me look guilty. You're all against me. This is a circus, not a trial." He pointed a trembling finger at the jury. "You can't convict me because of some stupid animal." But his tirade only worsened the impression. His lawyer tugged at his sleeve, whispering frantically for him to sit down. But the man shook him off, fists clenched, chest heaving. The contrast between his frantic behavior and the dog's relentless focus was striking. Where the defendant seemed unhinged, the dog appeared certain, deliberate, purposeful. The judge finally called for another recess, desperate to contain the chaos. "The jury will be escorted out immediately," he ordered, his gavel hammering so hard it echoed like a gunshot. Bailiffs moved quickly, ushering the 12 stunned jurors from the room. They went reluctantly, eyes still glued to the defendant, as if they could not tear themselves away from the spectacle. As the jury disappeared, the gallery erupted in murmurs. Reporters were already exchanging hurried whispers about headlines that would send shockwaves across the city. "Police dog targets defendant in courtroom outburst." The handler managed to coax the shepherd back into a sitting position, though its ears remained pricked, eyes never straying from the man it had marked. When the door closed behind the jurors, silence returned, but it was not relief. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of realization. The defense attorney slammed his palms on the table, sweat beading his brow. "This is intolerable," he spat. "My client cannot receive a fair trial under these conditions. That animal has contaminated the entire proceeding. The jury is compromised. I move for a mistrial." The prosecutor finally stepped forward, her voice calm, deliberate. "With respect, Your Honor, the defense is overlooking an important fact. This is not a random animal. This is a highly trained canine officer whose entire purpose is to detect danger, deceit, and hidden threats." The defendant's outburst, coupled with the dog's unmistakable reaction, cannot simply be brushed aside as coincidence. "Objection!" The defense barked, his voice cracking under strain. "This is speculation, nothing more." The judge massaged his temple, his gavel resting loosely in his hand. He had expected a difficult trial, but not this. Never this. He glanced once more at the shepherd, whose body remained tense, coiled like a spring. The judge knew he had to make a ruling, but even as he prepared to speak, his mind echoed with the child's words. "Doggy knows the bad man." For the rest of that day, The courtroom moved haltingly forward, but the atmosphere had changed beyond repair. Every testimony, every cross-examination, every objection was overshadowed by the memory of the dog's growl and the defendant's panic. The jurors returned, instructed sternly to disregard the incident, but their expressions betrayed them. They had seen too much. By evening, the defendant no longer looked like a man defending his innocence. He looked like a man trapped in quicksand, struggling harder with each movement, sinking deeper with each denial. His lawyer fought valiantly, but suspicion had already taken hold of every heart in the room. As the bailiffs escorted the jurors out once more, one woman glanced back at the shepherd, her brow furrowed. The man beside her whispered something, and she nodded grimly. The seed had sprouted, and in the corner, the toddler yawned, curling against her mother's shoulder. She whispered softly, as if to herself, "Doggie's right," before drifting into sleep. The handler scratched the shepherd's ear, murmuring, "Good boy," but even he couldn't shake the feeling that the dog had just done what no lawyer could, pierced straight through lies to reveal something raw, something undeniable. The trial was no longer about evidence alone. It had become about instinct, truth, and the uncanny alliance between a child's innocence and a dog's unwavering certainty. The courtroom had barely begun to settle after the toddler's explosive declaration when the prosecution requested a thorough review of the defendant's personal belongings. The request was met with fierce resistance from the defense, who insisted that the items had already been searched thoroughly and that no further inspection was warranted. "This is harassment," the defense attorney shouted, his voice cracking with frustration. "You cannot use the behavior of a child or an animal as a reason to invade my client's privacy." A judge leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He had dealt with many contentious disputes over evidence, but this felt different. A trained police dog, a child's pointed accusation, and the defendant's mounting panic had altered the atmosphere entirely. After a long pause, the judge finally spoke. "The court authorizes a re-examination of all personal items belonging to the defendant. This will be conducted in the presence of the prosecution, defense, and a neutral officer." The defendant's face went pale. His hands fidgeted in his lap as he realized that whatever had been hidden or believed hidden was now at risk of exposure. He muttered under his breath to his lawyer, "You don't understand. You can't know what's in there." His words trembled, betraying fear that he could no longer control. The items were brought into a secured side room within the courthouse. The defendant's briefcase, wallet, and small duffel bag were carefully placed on a long table. Officers, the handler, the prosecutor, and the defense attorney gathered around. The German shepherd sat beside its handler, nose twitching, tail stiff, a machine of focus and precision. The handler unclipped the leash and allowed the dog to approach. Immediately, the shepherd moved with purpose, sniffing each item in sequence. It ignored papers, pens, and folders that held mundane details of daily life. Its paws pressed lightly against the polished floor, eyes never leaving the defendant's briefcase. The dog stopped abruptly, sitting firmly and letting out a low, controlled growl. The room went silent. Even the defense attorney held his breath. What is it?" he asked, voice trembling. The prosecutor leaned forward, her expression unreadable. "Let's see," she said. Slowly, the bailiff unclasped the briefcase, revealing the ordinary contents: papers, notebooks, receipts. But as the bailiff shifted through the folders, a small envelope slid out from between two manila folders. It fell to the table with a soft thud. The dog's growl intensified, deep and commanding. Its paws pressed against the envelope, nudging it toward the officers. The handler whispered a soft command, trying to calm the animal, but it remained steadfast. The bailiff tore open the envelope. Inside were photographs, a USB drive, and folded sheets of paper. The photographs showed the defendant in situations that corroborated allegations the prosecution had struggled to prove heavily shadowed meetings, exchanges of cash, and interactions with known criminal associates. The defense attorney lunged forward, shouting, "This is planted evidence. Fabricated. You cannot use this." His voice was loud but shaky, and his argument lacked conviction. The prosecutor calmly held up the photographs. "In your client's own briefcase," she said, her tone cold and precise. "You claim planting? The evidence has been in his possession the entire time." The USB drive was plugged into a secure courthouse computer. The files contained financial records, dates, transaction logs, and names, all meticulously documented. Every entry pointed to activities that contradicted the defendant's statements, showing crime-related deception. The data was precise, clear, and impossible to dismiss. The defendant slumped into his chair, a hand pressed against his forehead. His lips moved, but no sound came. The child's words from the courtroom the day before, the simple, uncanny declaration, echoed in his mind. "Doggy knows." The prosecutor motioned to the handler. "Would you please confirm the dog's behavior?" she asked. The handler nodded. "This is a highly trained canine," he explained. "It does not react without cause. It signals detection of danger, deceit, or threats. When it indicated the briefcase, it did so with certainty. Its focus is deliberate, not random. In my experience, this behavior is rarely wrong." The defense attorney shook his head, voice rising in desperation. "This is prejudice. The dog's reaction is not evidence. The jury cannot base judgment on an animal's instincts." But the jury, seated in the courtroom once more, had already internalized what had transpired. They had witnessed the dog's reaction, the toddler's pointed finger, and now the unveiling of physical evidence. Even before formal testimony, suspicion had hardened into near certainty. The defendant could no longer control his demeanor. He muttered to himself, fists clenching, voice low and frantic. "I didn't have a choice. I had to." He glanced at the child, her innocent eyes staring up at the proceedings, and felt a pang of dread. The world was aligning against him in ways he could neither predict nor escape. The judge called the court back to order. The new evidence was formally admitted, and the prosecutor meticulously explained each piece. The photographs, the transaction logs, and the digital files painted a damning portrait. Every claim made by witnesses now had tangible, verifiable support. The defense's arguments faltered, their protests sounding increasingly hollow. In the gallery, the mother cradled her toddler, who now giggled softly. "Doggy's right," she whispered, patting the child's back. The little girl's simple words, combined with the dog's trained instincts and the evidence's undeniable weight, had created a synergy that could not be undone. By the end of the session, the atmosphere had transformed completely. The defendant's bravado was gone, replaced by palpable fear. The jury no longer observed him skeptically. They observed him with certainty. The child's innocence, the dog's precision, and the evidence's clarity had combined to break the defendant's facade entirely. The handler knelt beside the dog, scratching its ears and murmuring praise. "Good work," he said quietly. The shepherd wagged its tail slightly, eyes still watchful, as if satisfied that justice had been served. Even the judge, seasoned in decades of trials, felt the weight of the day. Law and instinct, reason and perception, had collided in a way that left him unsettled but ultimately respectful. He tapped the gavel lightly, calling the court to adjourn, but knew the trial's turning point had arrived. As the courtroom emptied, reporters speculated feverishly, jurors whispered to each other, and the defendant slumped forward, a shadow of the man who had entered the courthouse days before. Outside, the sun set over the city, casting long shadows across the steps, echoing the long, Unusual path this trial had taken from a toddler's words to a dog's instincts to evidence that could not be denied. And somewhere in the back of the courtroom, the toddler yawned, rabbit clutched tightly, eyes sparkling with simple satisfaction. She had done what she intended, though she could not have understood the magnitude. The world had shifted, and the phrase would linger in whispers for years to come. Doggy knows. The courtroom had entered a strange rhythm in the days following the discovery of the hidden evidence. The defendant sat slumped, shoulders heavy, as though carrying the weight of not only his actions, but the inexorable judgment of every witness, juror, and observer in the room. His lawyer whispered incessantly, but the words seemed to bounce off him. He could no longer hide behind strategy or legal jargon. The truth had begun to crack through every defensive wall he had built. The jurors were different now. Their expressions were sharper, their eyes more attentive, as though every gesture, every twitch, every word of the defendant was being dissected and weighed. The child's words, the dog's unyielding stare, and the damning photographs had merged into a single, undeniable narrative in their minds. It wasn't about speculation anymore. It was about pattern, certainty, and instinct validated by evidence. Witness after witness was called, but each one added only subtle reinforcement. A clerk testified about unusual transactions. A neighbor recounted odd meetings and late-night visitors. Each testimony seemed mundane at first, but combined with the visual evidence, the jurors saw web-forming threads connecting deception, illicit activity, and deliberate concealment. The defendant's composure deteriorated with each passing hour. He shifted in his seat, repeatedly tugging at his collar and running a hand through his hair. He shot frequent glances at the gallery, at the dog, at the little girl who had unintentionally ignited the chain of events. Each glance seemed to tighten an invisible noose around his neck. The defense attorney tried desperately to regain control. "Members of the jury," he began, voice wavering but forceful, "you must not be swayed by theatrics. You cannot convict based on a child's words or the reaction of an animal. Focus on the evidence that matters, the testimony, the documents, the facts presented under law." Yet even as he spoke, he knew the tide had shifted. The jurors were no longer passive observers. They leaned forward, exchanged glances, and scribbled notes with a deliberateness that revealed judgment forming before the official instructions were given. They didn't need theatrics. The combined weight of instinct, observation, and proof had already begun to guide them. The defendant snapped. Slamming his fists against the table, he shouted, "You're all against me. You don't know what I've done, what I had to do. It's not what you think." The judge pounded his gavel, calling for order. Silence in the courtroom. His voice, though authoritative, carried an undercurrent of unease. The child giggled softly from her mother's lap, unaware of the gravity her words had carried, and pointed once more at the defendant. "Doggy knows," she said quietly. The dog, seated beside its handler, lifted its ears and let out a soft, affirming growl. Its eyes never left the defendant. Every juror in the room noticed. Every heart, even those accustomed to courtroom procedure, felt the chill of instinct. The prosecutor, standing quietly for a moment, finally resumed. "Members of the jury, consider what you have seen. Contradictory statements, evidence discovered that confirms prior suspicions, and the behavior of trained professionals, both human and canine, that has highlighted inconsistencies and truths the defendant cannot hide from. Every action, every hesitation, every reaction has added to a clear narrative. This is not conjecture. This is fact." The defense attorney's protests grew more desperate. "You cannot allow bias to cloud judgment. The dog's behavior is not evidence. A child's declaration is not evidence. Rely on law. Rely on facts." But the jurors were no longer listening in the same way. Their eyes had hardened with certainty. The defendant's behavior alone had spoken volumes, his outbursts, his fear, his attempts at intimidation. Each word from his mouth contradicted the calm, precise narrative presented by the prosecution. Each glance toward the dog, each hesitation when confronted with the photographs, deepened their impression of guilt. In a brief recess, the jurors conferred quietly in the hallway. Their discussion was muted, but the tension was palpable. Even without the court recording it, their consensus had begun to take shape. They recognized patterns, instinct, and corroborated evidence. The toddler's words and the dog's reactions were not mere distractions. They had acted as catalysts, prompting closer scrutiny that uncovered undeniable proof. The defendant was unaware of the whispers spreading among the jurors. He fidgeted, muttered to his lawyer, and occasionally glared at the little girl, who now clutched her rabbit toy and whispered to her mother. Her wide eyes remained alert, as though she understood she had played a role in this unraveling, even if she could not articulate it. When the trial resumed, the prosecution called one final witness, a forensic accountant who detailed financial transactions linking the defendant to illegal activities. Each figure, each timestamp, each signature reinforced what the jurors had already intuited. The evidence was precise, methodical, and impossible to dispute. The defendant's face fell. His protests had grown quieter, almost desperate whispers, no longer capable of commanding attention. The child shifted in her mother's lap, yawning softly. She looked up at the dog, who met her gaze and wagged its tail slightly, a subtle affirmation. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, awaiting the inevitable. Finally, a judge instructed the jury to begin deliberations. The jurors filed out, expressions somber but resolute. The courtroom emptied gradually, leaving behind a heavy silence, punctuated only by the soft scratching of pens and the distant hum of fluorescent lights. The defendant slumped in his chair, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He avoided the gaze of the handler and the dog, aware that instinct had betrayed him in ways words never could. His lawyer whispered in his ear, voice barely audible, "We'll try an appeal, maybe." But the man did not respond. He knew that the collapse of his defenses had already begun. Outside the courtroom, the media swarmed. Reporters clamored to capture the story. The toddler, the dog, and the defendant's unraveling had created a narrative more compelling than any legal argument. Cameras flashed, questions were shouted, and microphones were shoved toward the mother and child, who quietly exited under protective arms. Inside, the courtroom sat empty but tense. The judge leaned back, eyes closed for a moment, reflecting on what had transpired. Law and procedure had collided with instinct and intuition in a way that defied conventional understanding. He had witnessed a trial transformed not by theatrics, but by alignment, evidence, instinct, and innocence converging to reveal truth. Hours later, the jury returned. Their expressions were unreadable, but the air vibrated with unspoken certainty. The foreperson stood, cleared her throat, and read aloud the verdict, guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. The defendant collapsed into his chair, his lawyer placing a hand on his shoulder, both stunned. The prosecutor exhaled softly, eyes glinting with satisfaction. A handler patted the dog's head. The shepherd's job was complete, its instincts validated, its actions decisive. The toddler clapped her small hands and whispered, "Doggy was right." Her mother hugged her tightly, smiling through tears, proud of her child's role in the unusual chain of events. The defendant was led away, silent and defeated, his world unraveling in front of dozens of witnesses, guided by the uncanny clarity of a child's words and a dog's unwavering focus. And the phrase would echo through the courthouse and beyond for years. Doggy knows. The courthouse was quieter than usual the morning after the verdict. The weight of the previous days lingered like a shadow. Reporters still crowded the steps outside, scribbling notes furiously, microphones aimed, cameras clicking. But inside, the air was heavy with the finality of judgment. The echoes of tension that had gripped every corner now dissipating into history. The defendant had been led away the night before, his face pale, eyes hollow with the knowledge that his carefully constructed facade had crumbled completely. The photographs, the financial records, the testimony, and the dog's unerring reaction had converged to leave him with no defense, no escape. Even his lawyer, exhausted and drained, knew that appeals could only delay the inevitable. The trial had been lost not merely in courtrooms or on paper, but in the collision of instinct, innocence, and undeniable proof. In the gallery, the mother cradled her toddler, whose wide eyes still sparkled with curiosity. She had been the unlikeliest of witnesses, yet her simple, pointed words had set events into motion. "Doggy knows," she had declared, and the room had shifted irrevocably. The toddler's voice, once tiny and innocent, had carried the weight of intuition in a way adults often dismissed but could not ignore. The German shepherd sat beside its handler, ears pricked, tail resting lazily now, but still alert. Its role was complete, yet its presence reminded everyone of the strange power it held, the ability to detect deceit where human eyes could not. The handler scratched behind the dog's ears, murmuring softly, "You did well, partner. You helped them see the truth." The dog leaned into his hand, calm but proud, as though acknowledging the gravity of its service. Outside, the press clamored for interviews. Reporters shouted questions about the toddler, the dog, and the unusual sequence of events. The mother shielded her child gently, offering only a small nod to indicate they would not speak at length. The little girl clutched her rabbit toy tightly, whispering softly, "Doggy's a hero." Her voice, though small, carried through the crowd, a testament to the unlikely bond that had influenced the course of justice. Inside the courthouse, the judge sat at his bench, reflecting on the extraordinary events. He had presided over countless trials, seen deceit, manipulation, and theatrics. Yet this had been unlike anything he had ever encountered. The child's words, the dog's instincts, and the discovered evidence had combined in a way that transcended conventional legal reasoning. It was a lesson in humility. Justice sometimes needed intuition alongside facts, innocence alongside experience. The jury, now disbanded, carried with them a story that would linger long after the verdict. They had witnessed firsthand the alignment of instinct, proof, and human intuition. They had watched a grown man unravel, confronted not just by law, but by the unerring certainty of a child and a dog. Their deliberations had been influenced subtly, undeniably, and they recognized that the trial had unfolded along a path no one could have predicted. Meanwhile, the defendant was processed into custody. His eyes were downcast, jaw tight. He had attempted to control every detail of his life, every narrative, every lie, but each strategy had failed. The photographs, the financial records, and even his own panic had betrayed him. He realized that control was an illusion, fragile against the weight of truth, instinct, and innocent observation. The prosecutor reviewed the case files one last time, satisfied that justice had been served. Every piece of evidence had aligned with the chain reaction triggered by the toddler's words and the dog's reaction. She reflected briefly on the unusual course of events, understanding that the law, while structured and precise, had occasionally relied on the unstructured brilliance of perception. Today, that brilliance had led to justice. The toddler, oblivious to the magnitude of her role, played quietly with a rabbit in a nearby park later that day. Her mother watched, smiling softly, knowing that the world had shifted subtly because of her child's observation. "Doggy was right," the little girl repeated, eyes bright, voice innocent yet knowing. It was a simple truth, but one that had echoed through the halls of justice, influencing adults in ways they could not fully articulate. The German Shepherd, meanwhile, returned to routine patrols. Its service record would now include an extraordinary event, a courtroom intervention that helped uncover hidden evidence and clarify the truth. For the officers and handlers who worked alongside it, the memory of the dog's precision and intuition would remain a point of pride and awe. They knew the animal had done more than follow training. It had demonstrated understanding, focus, and discernment that few humans could replicate under pressure. In the courthouse archives, the photographs, financial records, and the digital evidence were filed with meticulous care. Future lawyers, judges, and investigators would study the case, not just for legal precedent, but for the unusual circumstances that had led to a successful prosecution. Scholars might debate whether the child's statement or the dog's reaction had been more pivotal, but all agreed that the combination had been extraordinary, unprecedented, and decisive. The defendant, now in custody, would face the long process of imprisonment. Yet the story of his downfall would be told repeatedly, how a toddler's innocent observation and a dog's trained instinct revealed what lies had tried to hide. It was a cautionary tale about arrogance, deception, and the surprising ways truth can emerge, even in the most unexpected forms. As the sun set over the courthouse, a calm descended. Reporters packed up their equipment, jurors went home, and the building returned to its usual quiet hum. Yet the legacy of the trial lingered. People whispered of a little girl, a heroic dog, and the man whose fate had been sealed not by manipulation, but by observation and instinct. The judge lingered in chambers for a few more moments, reflecting on what he had witnessed. He tapped the gavel lightly, almost absent-mindedly, acknowledging that law and instinct could coexist. Today, they had worked together to illuminate truth. He understood that justice was not merely about statutes and procedures. It was about perception, awareness, and sometimes unexpected guides that pointed the way. And for those who had been in the courtroom that day, the phrase would echo forever, "Doggy knows." It was a phrase of simplicity, innocence, and ultimate clarity. A small child, a dog, and an unwavering sense of truth had combined to deliver justice in a way no one could have planned. The mother carried her little girl home, holding her hand tightly. The toddler looked back once, her eyes meeting the dog's in the distance. The shepherd wagged its tail lightly, a silent acknowledgement of a job well done. For everyone involved, the lesson was clear. Justice sometimes comes in the smallest forms, the quietest signals, and the instincts that cannot be taught. And as the city settled into night, the story would live on retold, remembered, and cherished as a tale of innocence, courage, and the unlikely ways truth reveals itself.